Welcome back, everyone, to Lecture Live. We've been gone for about a month because I have been moving to Philadelphia to pursue a doctorate in none other than art history. And Delana and I have crafted the idea that I would kind of take you all along with me and present to you a little bit, well, I say a little bit, most of what I'm actually learning in class. And this helps us both really. It helps me solidify what I'm learning, and then it helps me present it to you all, who then learn kind of really niche topics within art history and academia in general. So we've titled kind of this lecture, just to kind of get everyone warmed up and back on schedule, kind of a general introduction, and me explain kind of the projects that we're going to walk through just generally before we kind of get into more detailed stuff next time we meet. So the title is an art historical survey of 500 years. So we are going to be studying the 13th through the 18th centuries, and we're going to be all over the map. We're going to be primarily in the Netherlands, so it's kind of the low and high countries, so north and south, and then we're going to spend a lot of our time in Italy, and then we're also going to hop on over to the Ottoman Empire and kind of its connecting Eastern countries, modern day Iran, Turkey, kind of those types of places. And we're going to be studying a lot of different materials besides just kind of our usual, painting and sculpture. We're going to be incorporating architecture, manuscripts, and really a lot of different, I think, visual and textual culture that can be found in these different areas. So the whole thing is kind of, why are we studying these time periods throughout history among different cultures, and why is it important? Well, it's important, one, because I'm doing it in school, and so la-di-da, there you go. But the main reason for you all of why it's important is that these centuries saw significant advances in most areas of our life, or most areas in even what we consider contemporary life. We saw social impacts, religious wars, technological advancement, and all of these things play a major role into what we consider visual culture in our culture today. So these centuries really saw major advancement really worldwide, and it saw a new way to global communication, that these countries, these nations, these areas, however you want to categorize them today, they were in communication with one another, and it's largely been ignored throughout history, just the amount of globalization that happened during this period, because it's not what we consider kind of our broad scale globalization, but it was happening, kind of ideas of the Silk Road and just other gateways of communication in general, like the East India Trading Company. We'll kind of get into those areas as well. So what will we be looking at? We'll be looking at a little bit of everything. This is a kind of good example of an interior genre scene that we're going to see in the Northern Baroque and more Northern Baroque examples. And we're going to kind of decipher, these genre scenes are not as popular and not as well known and found within Renaissance and Baroque Italy, but they're found early on in the Northern Renaissance and Northern Baroque. And we're going to kind of examine, why. Is it religious context? Is it social preference? Is the culture changing? What's causing that culture to shift? We're going to examine those things. And then we're going to look at church interiors, architecture, manuscripts, painting, and sculpture, and anything else fancy you need to know. So this is actually a pretty interesting painting as well. It kind of shows us an interior scene of architectural structures. It kind of shows us this would be not really considered the high altar, but maybe an altarpiece going in the place of probably more of an altar scene not found in the nave of the church of the high altar, but it would have been an altarpiece somewhere else. And it shows us really architectural significance too, that it would have been commissioned and painted to mimic the church interior. So we're going to see these architectural scenes pop up in architectural not nuances, but similarities within their original cultural context. And we're going to also examine ideas of how people in this time would have experienced these things, because they wouldn't have experienced it the way that we experience it today, kind of with open churches and pieces of art kind of put everywhere. You know, a lot of these altars were installed in the 15th century, renovated in the 17th century, reinstalled in the 18th century, torn out in the 19th century, and then reinstalled 10 years ago. The point is that a lot of renovations have happened from, let's say, the 16th century Italy to today. And we're going to kind of go through those renovations and the significance of them. And when I say we're looking at manuscripts, we're going to be looking at, you know, just to clarify, we're going to be looking at the production of paper and why that was important. And that'll kind of get us into what we consider like the Gutenberg press, why were so many more books made in Europe when paper actually had Eastern origins in China. You know, where is that, and where did they communicate, and where did they cross over? Who taught the Europeans how to create these books? Well, come to find out, China was actually the major source of paper and actually figured it all out. And so it's always interesting to find out how countries in Europe, Spain, Italy, Germany, modern day Germany, how they figured out these things, England, and where that communication really started and how it matured. But we're not only going to be looking at the production of paper, which sounds boring, but it's really actually pretty cool. I'm going to make it cool. We'll be looking at book illumination, which is just kind of like a fancy term for book painting. There's a lot of gold, a lot of gilding involved. Calligraphy. Calligraphy was highly prized in particularly Islamic manuscripts, but in many other more Eastern cultures versus kind of what Europe and Western cultures would have considered major fine art, such as painting and sculpting. Calligraphy was the art. And we're going to look at the further development of bookmaking as an art form in general and why it's significant and kind of this transfer of knowledge. And all of this is to say, in this introduction, if you're interested in art history, particularly what's going on kind of in academia as well, and kind of the nitty-gritty of what art historians are doing, these lectures are for you. But if you like painting and sculpture, and if you're interested in these major Gothic churches and how they relate to the viewer, if you're interested in book illumination, although we'll be talking about primarily Islamic manuscripts, we're going to bring in medieval manuscripts stemming from Europe and connect it all too. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So to kind of give us an introduction, let's have a little bit of a sneak peek. Now, this is a print by Hendrik Goltzius, who was really a Northern Mannerist more than he was a Northern Baroque artist. And it's freaky, right? It's weird. It's like, does one man need these many muscles? Like we've got the point, you know? And so but Mannerism as a Northern style was really, it was meant to have a strange impact on the viewer. And because there was something a little off, because there was something a little strange, it was meant to bring the viewer, AKA people like me and you, in. And that tells us this print in general reached a lot more people than, say, a major high altarpiece found in a Northern church. So this definitely had an impact on how many people saw it, how people interpreted it, and how they kind of spent time with these pieces. And Mannerism in general, which we'll have a more in-depth lecture about the Northern Mannerism and how it connected to Northern Baroque art, is definitely interesting. Now, I can't leave the sneak peek without telling you a little bit about what was going on religiously. And I'll be talking about this painting more on in probably a lecture primarily on the impact of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, on art in general in the North, particularly in the Netherlands. This is kind of an allegory for the saving of souls. So you can actually see the Protestants here on the left, and the representation of Roman Catholicism and, you know, clerics, bishops on the right. And you can kind of see which side is winning, you know, but there was kind of a war of ideology happening, particularly in the Northern and Southern Netherlands. So think of, you know, Antwerp and Peter Paul Rubens. He was primarily working in, you know, kind of this Spanish Catholicism vein in the South, and the North was much more Protestant. That's kind of where John Calvin had a big impact. Luther and Calvin had a big impact, and those were major Protestant religious figures. And so you can kind of see what's happening in this boat right here. People are praying and God is saving them. And in this boat kind of here more on the right, people are saying like, here's my money. And so it's kind of a commentary on what was considered kind of the evil of the Catholic Church, or the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church. It says, oh, you can be saved if you pay a penance, and if you are penitent and you go to purgatory for a certain amount of time. So there were all these big theological debates happening in the North, because this is the Northern Baroque, which is the time of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and people are really trying to figure out what side they're on. And this is just another kind of scene that we're going to look at, and just another example that the Northern Baroque was really looking to Caravaggio and those artists, those Italian artists in general, which I've mentioned Caravaggio before, but really drastic shadows and drastic contrast between light and dark, which is known as either tenebrism or chiaroscuro. These Northern artists are looking to Italian artists as inspiration, but then they're kind of running off and doing their own thing and having their own interpretation with it. And I think I've mentioned before that these time periods, it wasn't considered copying, even if you took the same general layout and pretty much painted it the same exact way. It was not considered a copy, but it was considered that you were gaining inspiration and you were kind of putting your own spin on it and sense of style on it. Sorry, I think something got me. So we're also going to be looking at the work of Peter Paul Rubens, which is what we're studying in class right now, and kind of why he was such a popular artist. And I can give you a general download. Rubens was he was kind of an outlier in terms of artists at the time. He was very well educated. His father was a lawyer, and so he was actually prepped to go into becoming a lawyer at a young age. And so he was trained kind of in what we consider classical education for the time, and even today. He was trained in philosophy, history, mathematics, science, and then obviously knew Latin, Italian, spoke his native language. So he was very well educated, and so he became an artist, but he also became somewhat of a diplomat. And it's interesting that he constructs himself more often as a diplomat rather than an artist. And so we're gonna get into the nitty gritty of like, well, what we're gonna spend a week studying Rubens just in general, and kind of get into the nitty gritty of who was he and what was his contribution to kind of this Catholic Counter-Reformation, because he's almost the poster child of, kind of the South in that Spain-owned territory in the Netherlands. And you can definitely kind of see the inspiration. He's looking at a lot of Italian inspiration right here in this right-hand picture. He's looking at the musculature of Michelangelo, the rendition of horses in particular from Leonardo da Vinci, and really the drama coming from Caravaggio, I think, as well, not in terms of shadow, but in terms of kind of movement and how that moves along the space, even though it's obviously much more dramatic. He's got a lot of different inspirations that he's looking at, and he does not discriminate on inspiration. He kind of finds it where he is, which is probably what makes him such a successful artist. And now to do a total 360, I have put in a couple of these manuscripts just to introduce you to an art form that we have not studied particularly in lecture live, and probably many people have not studied it in general, because manuscripts, particularly in a language that we don't know, are not fun to study. But there's a lot of stuff happening in these manuscripts, particularly the Islamic manuscripts, and the structure of how particularly Qurans were used, and then the difference between how people would commission and patrons would commission, and then artists would come in and create Qurans versus more secular texts that have pretty much narrative stories. There's definitely a way that artists have depicted that. And as you can see, there is illumination, so there is book painting, and this was very popular. And you've got to think that this was accessible in a different way than kind of what we are going to study with church interiors or with prints. This had a very specific market, and with the production of paper, it became very popular and kind of a different way to disperse information. And so some of these works that we're going to study will still be on parchment. And when we kind of get into the development of paper, we'll kind of learn what, how they make papyrus, how they make parchment, what was the process in that. And then when they made paper, what were the processes in making different variations of paper? How did the press get involved? And so we're going to go in the history and kind of how they, in this kind of evolving of bookmaking, how they began to communicate with one another better, particularly in different areas of the world. And I wanted to show you just how beautiful these manuscripts and these paintings can be. They're fun to study in and of themselves. You can actually see that certain text is emphasized. And when we study Qurans, we'll actually learn that there's this idea of framing. So everything within the frame is considered holy, and everything outside of the frame is considered more secular. And so when we study these things, we're going to kind of run into theological ideas as well. But the reason calligraphy in general was so popular with these manuscripts and popular in Islamic culture and within the religion itself was that calligraphy began to be associated with the Quran, because that's what was mainly being produced, particularly in these early time periods. So calligraphy had this step above other art forms. It was associated with something holy. And we'll get into kind of ideas of that as well. And then we'll also be learning about Florentine church interiors and Italian church interiors in general, but we're going to spend quite a bit of time in Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce, which are major churches in Florence, had a lot of foot traffic. But what would you say if I told you that this picture that we see, this is in Santa Croce, this that we see is not what would have been there 600 years ago? What you actually would have seen, I wonder if I've got a picture. No, this is the picture I've got. What you actually would have seen is this area would have been almost entirely blocked off, probably beginning right here. So not this column on the left, but the second one right here. You would have had a rood screen, otherwise known as a tramezzo, which was pretty much a long bridge building-like structure separating the lay people, so people like me and you, from more religious people, which would have been the clergy, the friars, the monks. And that structure would have visually impaired the lay people from actually seeing what was going on. So taking part in communion, so taking part in the Catholic Mass. So they would have only been able to hear, they wouldn't have been able to see. And that tells us that this church experience is much different from a church experience that we experience today, whether in Catholic churches, Protestant churches, whatever. But these rood screens, which really the rood screen doesn't do it justice, because these were massive stone structures that would essentially create two different churches within one space. And so we're going to look at kind of like, what does that say about the hierarchy of the lay people versus the clergy? What about men and women? They often separated men and women. What was the church then primarily used for? If there were two separate churches, were there ever any exceptions? And we're going to learn about what these screens were and what these barriers were and what that really means and what that would have meant with how, in the context of how people would have experienced the church, experienced the art, and experienced this idea of what we would consider maybe preaching or reciting hymns or taking part in communion. And this painting on the left actually gives you an idea, which I'm, laying out rather quickly or rather succinctly. This gives you an idea of the rood screen. So don't pay attention to these arches right here, but if you look in the back and you see this structure, this second structure with these arches and kind of looks like a man's going in and a man's coming out. You see women here on the outside, on the outskirts, and you see kind of reminiscent, kind of just a slight picture of what the high altar would have been. That is what is considered a tramezzo, a rood screen, or even a ponte, which just means bridge. So that small structure right there with those arches, and I'll have better pictures and layouts and plans for you to see. But that essentially would have disconnected the lay church from the clergy or the friars or the monks. And that's a big deal, because that tells us that the lay church did not experience the same religious rights as these clergy, as these, exceptional members of society involved in the Catholic Church. And that has, ideas of equality, like I said, social structure, hierarchies. It also tells us just how much construction has been done on these churches. Because when you go and visit major cathedrals, major churches, these are open spaces, and there might be a screen like iron bars, and there might be a choir, which is just kind of like little, for simplicity's sake, kind of boxes that the monks or the friars would have sat in, while they were within the screen, within kind of this tramezzo, within this barrier. It really tells us that these people had quite a different experience than we do. And that kind of gets us into the problem of, like, we tend to modernize history. We tend to put our stamp on history and say, oh, well, I can't believe people of history did this or did that, or they thought this way. But we can't put our modern ideas, our modern context into history. We just have to take history pretty much how it is. And this was kind of how it is. They had vastly different experiences. They were separated as a society into certain classes, certain roles, and it's much different from the world that we live in today. And this picture on the right is just a picture of the high altar and in Santa Maria Novella. And you can actually see the church choir. I don't know that you can see it that well. I'll have to point all this stuff out later on. But the church choir is actually going to be situated around it and on the back side of it. And that was a relatively new renovation that Vasari, who's characterized as like the first art historian, came in and said that we needed to do to some of these churches. And it's really Vasari who was in charge and involved in the major renovation of Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce, both in Florence. So we're going to be studying all of that. But I wanted to give you kind of an idea of a general path that we're taking. And all of these things, although they don't seem connected, are interconnected to one another, particularly when we study the North and Italy, because the Protestant Reformation, which is kind of marked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses, kind of questioning and debating the Catholic Church. This is a big deal, and these rood screens are a big deal because the removal of these barriers primarily happened after the Council of Trent, which said, hey, we need to emphasize the role of the layperson in church. And so it tells us that tastes were changing. And so was that from the Protestant Reformation, or was the taste changing before? We're going to kind of examine that and examine the changes that happened in that. So I think it's going to be a really fun, well, I say semester because it's going to be a semester for me, but a really fun few months for you all, and a really fun lecture series to kind of follow along and not only what I'm learning, but what I think is important in terms of viewing these things. Because if you ever go to Italy, if you ever go to the North, and you are involved with art at all, or if you ever come into contact with, well, Islamic manuscripts in general, you can have an idea of the significance that these cultural objects really played in the context of where they're from and how they were really interconnected. And it really gets us to thinking, say, well, okay, what does Islamic manuscripts have to do with what's happening in the North and South? Well, I can tell you that the press paper stems directly from the East. And so how did the Reformation get its stuff out and get its information out? The use of paper, the use of a printing press. And so it tells us that these things are connected, that kind of this expansion of Europe and the evolving of societies and culture come from a very interconnectedness that sometimes we tend to not realize, or sometimes we tend to ignore, whether it's just from our own stereotypes, whether it's just from separate societies and locations and cultures that they really don't have anything to us and we don't have to do anything to do with them. But really, without the interaction of these two, Europe wouldn't be what it is today. And these other societies in the East wouldn't be what they are today. And of course, there's some bad stuff happening in the Middle East. I'm not trying to overlook that. But I will say the evolving and the maturation of these cultures, they're very interconnected. And we're actually going to learn in the class or in lectures over Islamic manuscripts, how interconnected they were with even Western philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and how calligraphers were doing the same thing that Italian painters were doing in trying to up their social status and say, look, we're educated, we deserve to get paid well, we deserve more commissions, all these things. We find so many, not just stylistic similarities, but cultural similarities as well, that I think is really going to be fun to kind of tease out and learn in this particular lecture series. So that being said, I know that this lecture is just a little short, but it's hard. It would have been difficult to not have this introduction, because I would have been hitting you over the head with the information and you would have been like, why are you explaining this to me? And now you kind of know. And so in the next couple of classes, I'm going to introduce kind of early Northern. We're going to focus a little bit more on the North next time, but I'm still going to kind of get you used to these concepts and ideas in general that we're going to go over. But before we get into the Northern Baroque, I need to lay out what was actually happening probably a few decades before. And then we'll kind of move on and we'll kind of do a fun little dance. I'll keep it pretty low. I'll keep it pretty diverse in the sense of we're not going to just spend a month in the North and then the month in Italy and then a month with Islamic manuscripts. I'm going to keep them interconnected, but we're going to be jumping back and forth, kind of how I see fit. And so it's really fun. And if you're interested in our history, and if you're interested in kind of these cultural objects in general, and not just painting and sculpture, but what else was happening, with architecture and really objects that people could own, and prints and books, then these lectures are definitely for you. And I think they're going to be fun. And I'm learning a lot. So I hope that you guys will learn a lot as well.